Everybody, good afternoon. This is another class of the PASTRES course. It deals with the uncertainties generated and by the policy dimensions, the institutional uncertainties, so-called, the implications and the impacts on pastoral livelihoods, and the ways somehow some principles materializes into policies, the ways these affect pastoralists across different regions of the world, and how pastoralists somehow respond and react and adapt, navigate those uncertainties. And it's basically the outcome of very many months of hard work we had by looking at different papers, interviewing people, participating to international workshops, and we basically have served through these materials and these conversations in 4 different regions of the world: Sub-Saharan Africa, Europe, different parts of Asia, and the Maghreb and Mashrek, or Middle East and North Africa regions. So in this class, we will try to explore very briefly what's the case in these different regions. And basically, we base this class on, and we want to introduce, we drive you through different papers that have been produced by the European University Institute in 2022, addressing these policy papers, addressing these 4 regions and the uncertainties that affect drylands and pastoralists more broadly. The idea is trying to understand how basic concepts that very often are those of pastoralists being backward, inefficient, and pastoralism being unsustainable, these principles that are quite persistent in a large part of the globe, materialize in policy making, in policy measures, in the legislative norms, and so somehow affect the life and the livelihood of pastoralists. The policy domains that are very often addressed by these policy measures are those of management of natural resources, land and land access, production and marketing of animal products, access to markets, therefore, land rights, as you said, infrastructure development, and more basically, development investments in the country for basic services, basic infrastructure, and basic facilities. As we will see, the role played by policymakers is one that generates a high degree of uncertainty for most of pastoral groups that we know on Earth, and the implications are quite complicated in the different contexts. Despite major diversities in geographical, ideological, and policy terms, very often policymaking in pastoral areas try to converge to materialize the principles that we said into policymaking. The outcome, as we will see, as you will see by reading the paper, is that very often pastoralists are somehow marginalized, not only in geophysical terms, but even in policy terms and in sociocultural terms. They enjoy little appreciations of their products and the services they provide to society, and limited representations in policy arena. There's a study from the World Bank in 1990s attested that the pastoral sector has experienced the greatest concentration of failed development projects in the world. Most herders have not improved their life, most rangelands have not improved their conditions, and very often the integration and the capacity of pastoralists to participate to local societies have decreased rather than improved. So this is quite a good example of the way somehow pastoralists have been complicated by recent policy making rather than integrated into society. The first region that is addressed in this class is the one of Sub-Saharan Africa, the Horn of Africa on the eastern hand, and the Sahelian West Africa, or in the Sahelian area, the Sahelian drylands in West Africa. And there are quite a number of dynamics that are similar, though to different extents, because the integration of pastoralists into policymaking in the Sahel has been to a good degree higher or better than in the Horn of Africa. This is one of the reasons for this, is that the composition of pastoral populations in the 2 regions is quite different. It's much more scattered and fragmented in the East African part, whereas there are few large populations in the West African side, in the Sahel. This implies that in large parts of the Sahel, pastoral populations are definitely divided into national minorities, but they represent to a good extent regional majorities. So their policy engagement is different from other people and other groups that are to a much lower grade and scale. When it comes to population, that's an important issue because Sub-Saharan Africa, the drylands of Sub-Saharan Africa host a large part of the pastoral populations of the globe, and a large part of the population in those areas is definitely a pastoral population. So these two elements are quite critical. The recent growth of population in the region, not only human, but also livestock population has been quite consistent. That has somehow provided an intensification of land use and of social and political relationships in the region. And as we've seen, the population is scattered among different groups and different areas with different specificities, but it can be agro-pastoral, pastoral, purely pastoral, nomadic, transhumant, but basically they rely on extensive livestock production. In these cases and these settings, nation states very often fought by other actors, agents, and interests, such as the colonial governance period, very often did not recognize the mobility and the cross-border trade and livelihood patterns of pastoralists, and very often try to block them and to complicate those vital economic opportunities. And on top of that, even in recent times, as quite a number of literature shows, the relevance of pastoralists in generating important contributions to the local economies are very often, as to the figures in this table, are very often very poorly appreciated and acknowledged in policy papers and in policy decision making. So pastoralism is definitely a key livelihood option for a large part of the population. The contribution of pastoralists to the local and regional and even to the export economy is quite relevant, but these tend to be very little recognized. And there are studies that attest that the investments undertaken by a large part of, in most of the countries of sub-Saharan African drylands is not adequate to the contribution of the pastoral people and communities to the local economy, to the national economy. And not only the funds are limited and very often sourced by international organizations in these areas, but very often the development paradigm is also quite misplaced, because most of the efforts are addressed to somehow settle, stabilize, control, and incorporate pastoralists and their resources into the national political and economic agendas and arena. The issue of land is quite critical in this respect. In the papers, you might find a number of examples, of boxes with examples. The Great Green Wall is one of these, whereas fixed, rigid boundaries and rigid logics try to impose environmental dynamics in ecosystems that are by definition non-equilibrium and quite dynamic. So not only in policy terms, but even in environmental terms, most of the investments and the development efforts in this region have been quite misplaced because they did not address the local dynamics, nor in agroecological terms, and neither in sociopolitical and cultural ones. The issue of cross-border people with animal being able to move for production, for trade purposes is another one that has been addressed at different levels in the two regions, the Horn of Africa and the Sahel. And despite a number of efforts have been done to somehow facilitate these, at least for the trade side, these exchanges, they very often, such as the ECOWAS transhumant certificate, very often have provided limited positive effect to pastoralists. And even when, more broadly, policy making has been in paper favorable, such as the African Union policy framework for pastoralists, the pastoral land framework for drylands, still from the African Union, or the declarations of Nouakchott and N'Djamena in the Sahelian region in 2013. Even when policy papers try to come to support and facilitate the livelihood of pastoralists, these are very often not implemented, as the recent laws set in Ethiopia and Nigeria, just for two examples that are provided in the paper, demonstrate the pattern that remains, the quite pervasive and persistent pattern is still the one of settlement, controlling and incorporating pastoralists that in a way make pastoral resource management less feasible, and on the other hand, doesn't provide pastoralists with reliable and better alternatives. So there's a large part of the pastoral populations that have been losing out by these processes. There are sense of frustration, marginalization, and grievances that in some parts of the regions, and increasingly so the case, generate elements of tensions and conflict. Pastoralists have adapted, as to our two case studies, the two PhD theses implemented by PASTRES in Ethiopia and Kenya, by evolving into the social support and collective actions, and try to somehow to provide opportunities for improving livelihoods despite a policy environment that is very often not in favor and not facilitating pastoral resource management itself. The governance failure in sub-Saharan Africa is quite evident by the high and increasing degree of conflict in the region, and the relevance of humanitarian assistance and the dependency that this have been generating in parts of these dry lands. So in the papers, you might find more details about how this has been taking place and which are the implications and the options related to the ways pastoralists navigate these uncertainties and try to develop through this. Now, another case study that we might now want to address is the European one. In Europe, in fact, the situation might seem quite opposite, because European policies definitely have a number of provide for a number of chances and opportunities to in support of in the appreciation and in the support of pastoral resource management and the related quality of the products and of the services that are provided by pastoralists. Let me find the right images. Yeah, this is what we have for the Horn of Africa. This is Europe somehow, Asia regions. Yeah, this is Europe, and this is the way policy framework has been evolving in the European context. Let me also try to get the right papers on this side. And so in European policymaking, there are a number of principles. Here we find in the paper that relates specifically, as you can see, assessing the policy frame in pastoral areas of Europe. And this is the table of contents with a nice picture from the Lake of Bolsena. In principle, in European policymaking, pastoralism and pastoralists are quite appreciated, because pastoralism is recognized for the multiple values in terms of contribution of cultural heritage, environmental management, territorial cohesion, and obviously also the quality of the products that pastoralists and more broadly extensive livestock system provide. So there is, in Europe, quite unique in the world, there is a whole set of policy measures and policy principles that are in support of pastoralism and provide direct support to pastoralists through direct and indirect subsidies, development schemes, and policy measures. So in principle, the situation is quite favorable. And even across the different CAP reforms, as we can see here, the issue of social responsibility, environmental protection, organic production, animal welfare are all somehow talking in favor of pastoralism as we know it. So in principle, there is a greater understanding and a greater support to pastoralism in the region. The CAP, as we see, that is the Common Agriculture Policy that somehow informs the largest part, because it's about from 30 to 40% of the European budget directly invested in rural areas. Of the total European budget, about 1/3 goes to rural areas. So there is a lot of money and there is good policy concern. This might seem the most favorable environment for pastoralism to develop and to evolve. It has to be said that the common agricultural policy uses a whole set of a whole jargon and a whole set of measures and of definitions and of principles that might sound quite weird for people not living in Europe, such as less favored areas, meaning that pastoralists produce and maintain landscapes in areas that are less suitable to other forms of food production, and they also contribute to high nature value farming systems. So they also contribute, on the other hand, not only to produce, but to maintain those landscapes and those ecosystems. So the whole system is in place, apparently, in support of pastoralists. What happens in practice, as we've seen in the last 3 decades, is that the figures for pastoralists and for their animals are decreasing quite consistently across decades. In the last 3 decades, we've been losing about 30% of the pastoral farms every decade. This is the case for Spain, Italy, and Greece, in the example that we've been studying in the papers. So whereas there's a perfect policy in place, in practice this does not materializes into more benefits or more support to pastoralists. In fact, when we go to understanding the measures and the details of the measures that are implemented by the common agricultural policy, and in parallel to that also by the trade policies and environmental policies set by the European Union through other DGs, not DG Agriculture in this case, we see that there's a lot of emphasis on high input supply, land holdings, large land holdings, and technological support that definitely go in favor of farms that are larger, located in high potential areas and producing very often intensively. So despite the good principles tested into papers, in practice, policy measures tend to support what is not pastoralism, but is just the opposite. This is why pastoralism, maybe in Europe, is suffering more than in other regions, by quite paradoxically. And there are, as you can see from the figures, there are important problems of generational renewals, important problems related to workforce scarcity, and problems related to abandonment of land. So we have quite fertile and wet soils that have been abandoned. That is not the case for other parts of the globe, where the pressure on land is increasing rather than decreasing. So the impact on pastoralism has been quite detrimental for this common agricultural policy, broadly speaking. And there might be a technical perspective or a policy perspective, a political perspective. Both maybe apply. On the one hand, there's been a poor design maybe of most of these policy measures, because they're quite rigid. They need to quantify, to measure, and there's a little degree of flexibility that is definitely what informs normally the resource management in pastoral areas. On the other hand, definitely there are other interests, such as the urban consumers or the intensive farming system and intensive livestock system. They seem to be much better lobbied and much more supported by the policy measures that are in place. So to end up with the European case, the technocratic approach and the institutionalized mechanisms set up by the common agricultural policy, despite the good principles, they don't operate in favor of pastoralists. And even here, the policy environment, despite, as I said, good principles, seem to be a major driver of uncertainty for most pastoralists in Europe, because it is informed by several contrasting principles and very often inconsistent rules. As it is explored by our PhD thesis in Sardinia and by the papers as well, pastoralists, though, survive and develop by navigating the different inconsistencies that are in place and trying to integrate and engage with environmental as well as market dynamics in a way that somehow favors their livelihood and provide opportunities for their development. The next case we are going to explore now is the one of Asia, somehow. Let me just... Then there's another specific paper that addresses the policy uncertainties generated in the different sub-regions of Asia. We have analyzed, in this case, the Soviet system, the ex-Soviet systems, that is Central Asia, the Russian, and the Russian Federation, the Chinese rangelands, that is mostly the plateaus on the western part of the country, the plateaus and the mountains, and India. The Indian case is also a relevant part of the story. We call that chapter Ever-Ending Revolutions because different revolutions have been taking place on the continent that have highly affected the resource management and the livelihood systems, the livelihood patterns of pastoralists to different degrees. In the Chinese case, there has been, through across decades, in the last century, I would say, an important process of reconfiguration of rights to land and opportunities to manage resources and to organize livelihoods that have somehow impacted quite consistently on the capacities of pastoralists to operate the ways they would normally do. The intense social and territorial engineering has been taking place not only through across time through the investments such as the Rust and Belt Initiative recently, but even more increasingly the settlement programs and the villagization schemes that have been taking place in parts of China, but also when it comes to the more political setup, the shifting property rights that have characterized access to land in China have been quite consistent in shifting from collective land, collective livestock to individual land with collective livestock, and then collective individual land and individual livestock. So individual responsibility system. There's been quite quite important changes in the regimes that affect the access to and the use of resources, land, labor, and livestock in the Chinese system that have been highly impacting on the pastoral systems locally. And these have been depicted as efforts to sustain economic growth or poverty elevation or take into account ecological concerns. What is clear is that pastoralists have not been very often the real target. I mean, the improvement of life for pastoral populations has not been the main driver of these policy changes, and therefore pastoralists have had to adapt by shifting their land use patterns, shifting their herd composition, accessing to alternative sources of livelihood, and negotiating through the interstices that these policy regimes, the changes in the policy regimes enable them to operate through. Then in the paper, that is this one here, that addresses specifically the Asian context, assessing the policy framework in pastoral areas of Asia. We've been also looking at the Soviet experience and the fact that during the Soviet period, there have been programs that have also been working in favor of pastoralism, such as huge investments in technological support for pastoral areas, and the fact that trade including of animal products was facilitated across the whole Soviet-related countries. These were elements that somehow have favored, to an extent, the economy in pastoral areas, despite the fact that the collectivization, the fact that the land had to be worked all together and livestock managed all together have not been very prominent for parts of the last century, but have somehow complicated to a large extent, as we know, the resource management of pastoralists, and generated the collapse of the Soviet system after that, and the fast pace of policy changes has generated high degrees of uncertainties for the very many populations the very many pastoral communities that populate Central Asia and northern parts of Asia. So complications, uncertainties, policy changes, and the shift from a centrally planned and centrally controlled resource system, such as was the Soviet one, has led to a quite differentiated pattern of agendas and interests taking over in the different countries, with a legislation, as to the table we have here, page 6 of our paper, legislation that concerns the access to rangelands, to lands in pastoral regions in Central Asian countries, has been going in very many different directions from one country to another, and the incorporation into market and state mechanisms has been quite different in pace and in direction from one country to another. So from the uncertainties generated by a central command system to the different uncertainties generated by changes in the access to resources and in the new ideological framework that have been informing policymaking in the different countries of the Soviet system. Finally, there's the Indian case, as we said, where the revolution here had been not a red revolution, but a green one, meaning that very many investments and policy paradigm has verted into converting rangelands into irrigated farming areas through, according to the Green Revolution paradigm, as we know it. And these have definitely contributed to a significant reconfiguration of the ecological as well as the institutional landscapes in the continent, across the continent, because Asia is as large as a whole continent. And this has often implied the displacement and the dispossession of pastoralists that have had to renegotiate their access to land, their capacity to move, and their opportunity to integrate with the new land use systems, the new market system, and the new institutional setup. So overall, in Asia, what we come up with in our analysis is that despite contrasting agendas in ideological terms, communist or socialist revolutions and green revolutions that follow quite different ideological patterns, what is in common in the different parts of the continent is that the dismantling of pastoralism as we know it, so mobility, flexibility, and the capacity to access different resources in different periods, have been definitely challenged across the whole continent. And the incorporation into state and market-related mechanisms has often been working for dismantling pastoral systems that have very often been perceived and rationalized as problematic agents to the idea of development in China, in Russia, in the Soviet system, as well as in India. And so this has not only generated uncertainties, but even complicated to a large extent the evolution and the development of pastoral communities and pastoral areas. Pastoralists have often adapted by renegotiating their engagements with the different land users or the different institutional setup, by reinforcing and by reconfiguring their herds as well as their social networks, and also by diversifying their livelihoods and try to use the market as a new opportunity, as a new domain with its own uncertainties that somehow complement their economies that are not anymore autarchical, but increasingly integrated into the wider societal picture. And then the last regional case addressed in our papers is the one of West Africa and Northern Asia, the so-called WANA region, spanning from Morocco up to Turkey. And even in this case, what we understood, what we assessed is that despite ideological trajectories quite different through time and from one country to another, ideological perspective in the sense of policy framework that informed policy investments and policy decisions, such as being socialist or being anti-socialist or capitalist and so on. In whatever the country, the idea was very often the same, that pastoral people had to be somehow incorporated into state structures And a main understanding for us is that drylands represent in very many of these countries the largest part of the country territory, and therefore being able to control those drylands and the populations inhabiting those drylands was and still is quite strategic in political and economic terms. And drylands are very often also the areas that border from one country to another, and there are very often tensions between one country and another, and very often pastoral communities tend to be on both sides of borders that are quite tense and controversial. So the idea of the main informing element of these policies, despite, as I said, the ideological differences, was to control drylands and to control the communities that could have been Berbers or Bedouins or Kurds that inhabit those drylands. And there's a main difference also from amongst this country between those that have some oil or mineral generated wealth and those that don't have, because the degree of engagement and investment have definitely been quite different in the different cases. So despite, as I said, ideological trajectories and different policies informing different periods, and despite the fact that there are tensions and there's no regional body, well, there are regional bodies, but there's no regional coherence as we've seen in Europe or in other parts of Asia or Sub-Saharan Africa. So each country on its own, but the point is that despite these diversities and controversies, the ideological framework that informed drylands management somehow has been very often the same. And the same has been translated in our terms, as we've seen here. This is the area, is what we call inverted mobility, in the sense that at the end of the story, what we find nowadays in the region is that in all of the countries in the WANA context, animals basically move very little, and any kind of input, labor, water, feed is brought to them. So there has been somehow an inversion of the typical pattern that characterizes pastoral areas, and nowadays pastoralists exist to a limited extent only in marginal and peripheral areas, whereas most of the investments when it comes to livestock production and dryland management, rangeland management, goes into settling people, intensify and stabilize the production systems, and integrate them with state and market mechanisms, with evident and significant implications for pastoral livelihoods. Where is this inverted mobility coming from? As I said, on the one hand, the need and the political will to control drylands and dryland populations. On the other hand, the huge investments made in policy terms and in technological terms and in financial terms in bringing those resources to pastoralists in order to settle them and to control them. The sealing of borders, conflict areas and tensions, all these have been working in the same direction, not to mention the drought events of the 70s and the 80s that have characterized the crisis of food systems in the region, that we know nowadays one region is the one that depends to a largest extent on import of food for the different countries. So all these elements together have pushed policymakers in this region to all go in the same way, in the same direction. That is the one of settling people, controlling them, and investing in bringing them resources in order to increase to a large extent and stabilize the output of livestock products that are highly consumed in the region, and at the same time controlling, co-opting, and integrate their economies into the national economy. So what we mentioned in our paper is that what used to be the emergency and relief paradigm that used to be bringing inputs to the animals because of a drought problem or of a conflict has become the development paradigm. So what used to be the exception have become the case, and nowadays inverted mobility gives an idea about the fact that there's no mobility except for everything else that is not animals. So in these terms, pastoralists, as we know them, have been, as I said, marginalized in peripheral areas, not only in physical terms, but even in political and institutional terms. Most interest and investment have been diverted to the production of cattle in intensive ways, to farming systems, crop systems through irrigation schemes, and even poultry. So any kind of local production is good, but not the pastoral one to a good extent. That used to be the very typical and traditional of the region. The impact in socioeconomic as well as environmental terms have been quite enormous, as we will see here. These are the different patterns that have been somehow pursued in order to achieve this kind of coherence at regional framework, even if the inspiring ideologies are quite different. But interestingly enough, these are the figures as well that inform how the number of animals have been growing to serve the growing demand from urban population as well in the different countries. And this is for sheep and goats, have been almost doubling in the last 40 years, with significant impacts on the production system as well as on the environment, because degradation of rangelands is due to the lack of mobility and the intense import of inputs, production inputs to the pastoral areas, the livestock areas now we would call them, has been, how to say, impacting on local ecosystem dynamics. Even in this case, pastoralists have adapted to a good extent. Immigration have been a main element, taking a main strategy that has been associated to keeping animals. And as our PhD thesis demonstrates for the case of southern Tunisia, social networks, reconfiguration of land use and herd composition, as well as diversification of local economies through migration, have been major strategies pursued by pastoralists to adapt to these shifting conditions and the related uncertainties. So, coming to a conclusion of, how do you say, coming to a general conclusion about these 4 case studies of different 4 regions of the globe where pastoralists are prominent to a good extent, is that the ideological perspective, starting from the fact that rangelands are considered as empty, unstable, and unproductive, and therefore the idea that pastoralism itself, so extensive livestock breeding, very often through mobility, is irrational or backward, destructive, and potentially threatening in security terms, have been informing policymaking directly or indirectly across the different regions, as we've seen. No matter what the period in time, what the ideological perspective, what the nature of the country or its historical pattern, the idea is that pastoralists, in order to become modern, they have to stop being pastoralists. That's the main trend we've seen across the different regions. And definitely pastoral areas are in need of development. That's the other interesting and important element that is somehow brought into practice, operationalized through different frameworks. We've identified some, the idea of environmental degradation, and therefore we have to support local communities to better use their ecosystems, their resources, the climate change perspectives, conflict perspective, governance perspective, whereas pastoralists are unable to govern on their own resources, through different forms of investments and engagement with markets, humanitarian approaches, and so on and so forth. There are a number of, let's say, theoretical frameworks that have been informing differently the investments in pastoral areas in this perspective that those areas need development to be brought from outside. Obviously, these patterns have not been free from consequences for pastoralists. As we've seen in very many pastoral regions, there are conditions of, we could say, crisis, generational renewal, environmental degradation, food insecurity, conflict, you name them. But there are problems, but there are also opportunities. That is what PASTRES has been trying to address in these 5 years. And pastoralists very often are much more adaptive and flexible to navigating the inconsistencies and the controversial aspects of these different policy framework and investment patterns. So my suggestion is definitely to go through the papers. You would find them in our PASTRES website amongst the products and publications, 4 regional papers and 1 article that somehow, 2 policy briefs, sorry, and 1 journal article that somehow summarizes in 20 pages all these debate and discussions. And having said that, I thank you very much for your assistance here and for having been with us across this period of PASTRES. Thanks again.